Okay, here we are, episode 7 of Industry, and of course in the drama things are hotting up, but we're really interested in the technical things, the things that are true, the things that are not true. You'll notice at the very beginning they're talking about Riff Day, and they have to present, and this concept of that there's going to be a kind of attrition. And again, as I said before, there's typically a 2-year analyst program. At the end of the 2 years, then a lot of people go to business school, and at that point people have to decide whether they stay. So I'm guessing that they're trying to do a play on that. You would never have a presentation, and you would never broadcast it to the whole firm. So that clearly is not true, but of course it includes good drama. So let's take a look at the technicals of this episode.
Okay, well, could you set up a sit-down for Monday?
Okay, I'll feedback.
Oh, we should go together. We don't let grads meet clients alone pre-riff. And can I get some decks done pre?
I don't think that's going to be necessary. She doesn't really read stuff like that.
Okay.
So here we've got Harper and Daria chatting about a client meeting. And Daria comes up and says, well, we don't let grads go on their own to client meetings. But they let grads book $50 million trades. That makes no sense. And sure, you probably wouldn't let grads in the early stages go to client meetings on their own, but you certainly wouldn't allow them to book $50 million trades. So I think that there's a bit of a disconnect in some of the things they're allowed to do and some of the things that they're not allowed to do. She also mentions decks, and decks mean a set of PowerPoint slides typically. And these are a presentation that you would give to a client in PowerPoint, and often the analyst will get involved in producing those, and that's particularly true if you're in the investment banking division.
Things have changed. For one, we are moving our operations to London.
That's great.
Yeah, Brexit's a 20-year problem. This just makes sense for us. Our new mandate's more complex products.
Are you still going to be trading single stocks?
You're a great time. We just need a little more than Clement has to offer.
Look, let's just do a trial period. From next week, I'll be a permanent hire, so I'll be able to service you properly. And we'll do our usual calls, and if it doesn't work, then... Look, I know you don't want to lose Pierpoint's research.
I can read. I don't need someone to read to me. I need someone with a view. You understand? I have proper responsibility now. My primary coverage can't be an old man and a kid, okay?
So here we've got Rob and Usman at a client dinner, and they're talking, and Usman is the asset manager or fund manager, or probably his role would be called portfolio manager, and then Rob is on the sales desk, and he is the coverage that is servicing the asset manager, who's Usman. And Usman is talking that maybe he is going to move his primary coverage, which is his main firm that he will trade through, and they'll also potentially provide financing as well. So that's what they mean by prime coverage. And he's talking about that their mandate, which is their almost rules of what they can invest in, is changing and becoming more complex, and they're going to go into complex products. And that probably means things like derivatives or potentially structured products. And that does sometimes happen, but usually you would raise a new fund to do that. Whereas Rob is saying, are you still going to trade single stocks? Now that probably means that Rob is focusing on what we call cash equities. In other words, where you buy equities for cash, there's no derivatives involved, and there's typically a separate desk for cash equities. Now, what Rob is going on to say is that, well, don't you want to keep Pierpoint's research? Because remember, one of the key things that the broker-dealer is providing to the portfolio manager is ideas, trade ideas, investment ideas. And that's where the research comes in as one of the competitive advantages for Pierpoint, because they're essentially giving what they're calling in the TV show a view, which is an idea of what they should do for a particular situation, whether it's a dollar going to move or an investment strategy. So this is an interesting conversation between the sales desk, Rob, and the portfolio manager, Usman.
Okay, I'm sorry to do this here, as it's slightly awkward, but it's gotten back to me that you openly discussed your comp. It's not important how I know, I just know.
Well, I wasn't bragging about it. Who told you? Yasmin?
Doesn't matter. But you can imagine what people are saying.
What are people saying?
Look, Harper, I don't have any favorites. Maybe you were Eric's, but that's no way of managing people. Pierpoint are going to ask for the surplus 25K back.
Now here, Dara and Harper are talking, and Dara is chastising Harper for talking about her comp. I know that she signed a document saying that she wouldn't do that, and she got this kind of overly large bonus, but there's no way that there's any expectation that people wouldn't discuss compensation in these situations. So it's pretty unrealistic. And I don't think they could do anything about it if Harper did say that she hadn't discussed it. And I think it would be very hard for them from a legal perspective, once somebody has been awarded a bonus, in writing to withdraw that and get the money back. That would be a highly unlikely situation. And I suspect they could have some employment problems from a legal perspective if they did do that. So that's not terribly realistic.
You ready to talk about how you're positioned?
Right, the only thing I want to be positioned for is when Trump opens another camp and sticks all the short sellers in with the Mexicans, and then at least I know that we're going higher.
So here, what we have is Nicole, who is the portfolio manager, and the sales team, Daria and Harper. And they have bumped into Nicole, and Nicole is talking about her position, and she is talking about putting the short sellers in the same camp as the migrants on the Mexican border, basically to shut them away. Because if you are positioned long, as she is, you will want the asset to go higher. And I presume that they're talking about the dollar in this case. So anything kind of political and macroeconomic will potentially affect the currency. So she's basically saying, I'm long, get rid of the short sellers because I want the dollar to go higher. And that's why they're talking about how she's positioned, how her portfolio is structured if the dollar goes higher. And in this case, it looks as though it's kind of exposed to the dollar. So the dollar increases in value, the portfolio will also increase in value. I mean, I think although Nicole, played by Sarah Parish, is a very negative character, she's such a good actress. And I'm sure there's certainly a little people, certainly with the same personality as Nicole in The City. But it's an interesting scene from a technical point of view as well.
Let me get my things. Years box up in seconds.
Hi, this is Daria from Point. I was if I'm expecting to Stacey McRae, please.
Now in this scene, sadly, Clement is being fired. And the reality is, it's a brutal process. And there's a couple of reasons why. Firstly, these people are dealing in very, very large amounts of money. So if somebody has been fired, you generally, from a kind of compliance and security point of view, you don't want them around. As a consequence, usually when somebody gets fired, they have to leave immediately. Not always, but usually. And that literally means you are walked to your desk by security. You have to pack everything up and in a bin bag, or what they're calling that cardboard box, which is known as a banker's box. Fill it all, and then you're escorted to the door. Now, it's likely that in those situations, certainly if you've worked there for a number of times, people around you would come and say goodbye. They wouldn't just sit there. So that's pretty unrealistic. But in terms of actually having to go and clear your desk immediately, that is fairly realistic. That's particularly true if you are fired. You will be walked out the door. If you're made redundant, there may be some situations where you're not necessarily walked out of the building, but they certainly will stop all your access to the systems immediately, often in the meeting where they're having it. So if you get fired, you would get walked out. It's very brutal, but to an extent, these people do get paid a large amount of money. They're dealing with very, very sensitive issues and large amounts of money for their clients, so you can't really have any risk of things going wrong. But nevertheless, it's a very brutal process, and this does reflect it. But it's a little less harsh because people would come up and say goodbye and say, let's get a beer afterwards.
I just wanted to confirm some ETFs that my traders had forwarded to your company.
Now here, Daria is talking about ETFs. And what ETFs are exchange traded funds. So you can either, if you have money, give it to a portfolio manager who will actively manage that money, making decisions on which sectors to invest in and which stocks to pick in those sectors. And that's known as active management. Exchange traded funds are funds that are traded on the exchange, but they typically have a formulaic structure. So what that means is you could have an exchange traded fund that is the FTSE 100 or the S&P 500. In other words, it reflects the returns you will get from investing in the FTSE 100 or the S&P 500. It won't be any different in terms of the mix compared to that particular index. And so they have become increasingly popular, mainly because if you look at the research shows that actually active management in many cases is just not worth the fees, the extra fees that you have to pay. And in fact, what they're kind of terming in many cases as a passive investment, investing in exchange traded funds, which will reflect the performance of an underlying asset, is a much more cost-effective way of investing.
The words Charlie and brass came up a number of times in your conversation with Maxim at Silver Kite.
Okay.
Certain words and phrases automatically ping, and then it gets elevated.
Now here we have Hillary talking to Yasmin, and Hillary's got a whole load of transcripts of things that have been said, and I think they're talking in this program about the instant messaging and email. This is absolutely true. Everything will get tracked, but it's not just instant messaging and email. It will also be your voicemails and your conversations. So every conversation on the trading floor is recorded, and those conversations are screened for words. And really what they're focused on finding is less of kind of the drugs and rock and roll stuff that Hillary's talking about here, and much more potential insider trading or where things have gone wrong. So if, for example, you agree a trade verbally and you disagree about the terms, as Harper had earlier with one of her clients, then you would go through the tapes. Now, they're not tapes anymore, they're just stored on a computer, but you'll go through the tapes, and in many cases, the software will actually transcribe what is said, so you can do screening that way, and they will do some checks. So that's why everything's recorded. It is true that there are certain keywords that will get pinged. And I've actually been on a training program in New York where I was teaching one of the leading banks, and literally someone came into the room saying, we've got a situation, someone in the room who we know, and we know who it is, has been going to inappropriate websites, and we need to talk to them. And we will talk to them, but this is a message to everyone saying you shouldn't do that. So that is absolutely true, and that does happen. There's a lot of tracking. That is pretty much it for episode 7. Not a massive amount's happened that we can talk about technically. That's not true from a kind of drama and personal lives of the individuals that are in the actual episode. But I think in episode 8, things start to hot up and we've got a lot more to talk about. So I'll see you then.